you hear the word zombie, you probably imagine a corpse with empty eyes, a monster stumbling through smoke and blood, a creature born in horror films, comic books, and nightmares. But what if I told you that long before Hollywood turned the word into a monster, the Atlantic world was already haunted by a far more terrifying reality? Not the fear of the dead returning to life, but the fear of the living being stripped of freedom. The fear of chains, of plantations, of men and women hunted like animals. And hidden inside that history is the story of a name that still echoes through time. Zumbi, not a creature, not a myth, but a real man, a fugitive, a warrior, a king of the escaped, and the symbol of a rebellion so powerful that an empire spent decades trying to erase it. This is not the story of a zombie. This is the story of Zumbi dos Palmares, the man who turned the jungle into a fortress and freedom into war. To understand Zumbi, we have to leave behind the world of vampire castles and horror films. We have to enter a much darker place. 17th century Brazil. At the time, Brazil was one of the most valuable colonies in the Portuguese Empire. Not because it was peaceful, not because it was prosperous for everyone, but because it produced something Europe craved like an addiction: sugar. Today, sugar feels ordinary. A spoon in coffee, a sweet in a market, a dessert at the end of a meal. But in the 17th century, sugar was a machine of wealth. And like many machines of wealth in history, it was powered by human suffering. Across the northeastern coast of Brazil, vast sugar plantations spread across the land. The mills never truly slept. The fields demanded labor from sunrise to darkness. And that labor was built on the bodies of enslaved Africans, men, women, and children ripped from Central and West Africa, thrown into the Atlantic, and sold into one of the most brutal systems in the early modern world. This is the first thing we must understand about Zumbi. He was not born into an ordinary kingdom. He was born into a world built to destroy freedom itself. By the 17th century, Brazil had become one of the beating hearts of the Atlantic slave economy. Portuguese colonists had discovered that the northeastern region, especially Pernambuco and the surrounding captaincies, was perfect for sugar cultivation. Perfect climate, perfect soil, perfect distance for Atlantic shipping. And so, plantation society expanded with terrifying speed. But sugar had a problem. It consumed people. The work was relentless. Cutting cane under tropical heat, carrying heavy loads, feeding the furnaces, enduring punishment, disease, hunger, and exhaustion. Indigenous labor had already been exploited violently. But the colonial system increasingly turned toward enslaved Africans on a massive scale. Ships crossed the Atlantic again and again, bringing people from Angola, Congo, and other parts of Central and West Africa into a world of forced labor. Many died before ever reaching land. Many died shortly after arrival, and those who survived entered a system designed to crush not just the body, but the memory of who they had once been. Names changed, languages were attacked, families were broken, beliefs were ridiculed or forbidden. The plantation was not just an economic institution, it was a machine for remaking human beings into property. And yet it never fully succeeded, because some people refused to remain property. Some ran, some hid, some fought, and deep inside the forests and mountains of Brazil, those fugitives began building something extraordinary. When enslaved people escaped in colonial Brazil, they did not always flee alone. Sometimes a single man vanished into the forest. Sometimes a family disappeared into the hills. Sometimes entire groups escaped together. Over time, these communities of fugitives became known as quilombos. To Portuguese authorities, they were criminal hideouts. To plantation owners, they were economic sabotage. To slave catchers, they were targets. But to the people inside them, quilombos were something far more radical. They were experiments in freedom. Places where the hunted tried to become human again. Places where African traditions could survive, adapt, and fuse with new realities. Places where people could plant, marry, worship, train, negotiate, and defend themselves beyond the reach of the plantation. Some quilombos were small and short-lived, a hidden cluster of huts in the forest, a temporary refuge near a river, a camp destroyed after a single raid. But one quilombo would become something much larger than a camp. Larger than a village, larger perhaps than anything the Portuguese ever expected escaped slaves to build. Its name was Palmares, and Palmares would become more than a refuge. It would become a challenge to colonial power itself. Palmares did not appear overnight. It grew slowly, like a wound the Portuguese could not close. Some historians believe its roots reached back to the late 16th century. Others focus on the 17th century, when it expanded into a powerful confederation of settlements in the mountainous region later associated with Serra da Barriga in northeastern Brazil. What matters most is this: Palmares was not just one village. It was a network, a cluster of fortified communities, often called mocambos, linked by family ties, military cooperation, trade, and shared survival. Over time, Palmares developed into something astonishing. Fields were cultivated, food was grown, defenses were built, leaders emerged, watch systems were organized, weapons were collected or forged. There were routes through forests, knowledge of the terrain, systems of warning, and strategies for resisting attack. This was not chaos. It was political organization born under pressure, a free society built in the shadow of slavery. And that made it dangerous. Because Palmares did not merely prove that enslaved people could escape, it proved they could endure, govern themselves, defend themselves, and inspire others to run. To the Portuguese colonial elite, Palmares was not only a military problem, it was a contagious idea. The Portuguese did not fear Palmares simply because it existed. They feared it because of what it represented. Every escaped slave who reached Palmares was one less laborer in the cane fields. Every successful raid on a plantation meant stolen weapons, stolen food, and stolen confidence. Every rumor about Palmares spread a dangerous message across the colony. Escape was possible. And once people believe escape is possible, control begins to crack. This is why maroon communities across the Americas were so threatening to slave societies. They were not just shelters, they were living propaganda against slavery itself. Palmares sat like a defiant scar across the colonial imagination. Planters imagined it as a nest of rebellion. Officials described it with fear, anger, and obsession. Military expeditions were sent against it again and again. Some failed in the jungle, some returned with prisoners, some burned settlements only to discover that Palmares would rise again somewhere deeper in the interior. The more the Portuguese tried to erase Palmares, the more it seemed to transform into legend. And legends are dangerous in a slave colony, because legends make people brave. One of the greatest mistakes we can make is imagining Palmares as a simple hiding place. It was not merely a camp of runaways. It was a society carrying memories across the Atlantic. Many of the people who reached Palmares came from Central African worlds shaped by the kingdoms of Congo and Dongo, among others. They did not arrive in Brazil as blank slates. They arrived with languages, with military knowledge, with agricultural skills, with religious traditions, with political concepts, with memories of kings, nobles, warfare, diplomacy, and ritual authority. Palmares was born in Brazil, but parts of its imagination came from Africa. This matters because it helps explain why Palmares could become so organized, why it could sustain leadership structures, why titles, alliances, and military discipline mattered, why resistance there was not merely reactive but strategic. Palmares was not simply a place where slavery was escaped. It was a place where fragments of stolen worlds were being reassembled under impossible conditions. And from that reconstruction, leaders began to emerge. Some would be remembered as founders, some as negotiators, some as warriors. And eventually, one name would overshadow them all: Zumbi. But before Zumbi could rise, another figure stood at the center of Palmares, a ruler whose choices would shape everything that came after. His name was Ganga Zumba. If Zumbi would one day become the legend, Ganga Zumba was one of the men who helped build the stage on which that legend could exist. In Portuguese records and later histories, Ganga Zumba appears as one of the great leaders of Palmares, a central authority in a growing confederation of free communities. Even his name carries power. Scholars debate the precise meaning and linguistic history surrounding names like Ganga Zumba and Zumbi, but what matters for our story is how the Portuguese understood him as a ruler, a dangerous one. Under his leadership, Palmares was not merely surviving, it was consolidating. Communities were growing, authority was hardening. The Portuguese no longer faced scattered fugitives. They faced an organized enemy, a black polity in the interior, a rival source of power in a colony built on human captivity. And in the decades ahead, that tension would only intensify. Because the stronger Palmares became, the more violently the colonial world would try to crush it. And somewhere within that world of war, escape, memory, and resistance, a child would be born. A child whose name would one day become larger than the kingdom itself. History does not introduce Zumbi with certainty. Like many people born in the world of slavery, fragments of his early life are hidden by silence. No royal archive carefully preserved his childhood. No court painter recorded his first years. No official biography was written to honor him while he lived. What we have instead are scattered reports, later testimonies, and the long shadow of oral memory. From those fragments, a picture begins to form. Zumbi was likely born inside Palmares in the mid-17th century, not in freedom as modern people understand it, but in a war for freedom already in progress. He entered a world where every child would have learned the meaning of danger early. The crack of muskets, the possibility of raids, the tension of hiding and rebuilding, the knowledge that the Portuguese wanted Palmares destroyed. This matters psychologically, because some men are shaped by peace and later thrown into war. Zumbi appears to have been shaped by war from the beginning. He did not step into conflict as an outsider. He was born inside the furnace, and that changes a person. And then, the story takes a turn almost too cinematic to be real. At some point during his youth, Zumbi was captured by the Portuguese. The exact details remain debated, but the broad outline survives. The future king of Palmares did not spend his entire childhood inside the safety of the Quilombo. He crossed into the enemy's world. Some accounts claim he was given to a priest, that he learned Portuguese, that he was baptized, that he was taught Christian doctrine, perhaps even reading and writing. If true, this detail changes everything, because it means Zumbi did not merely fight the Portuguese from a distance. He may have studied them from the inside, their language, their religion, their assumptions, their arrogance. Imagine what that does to a young mind, to be born in a fugitive kingdom, then taken into the civilization trying to destroy it. To hear one world call itself lawful, while knowing it was built on chains. To be told obedience is virtue, while your own people are hunted in the forest. This is where part 1 ends. Not with Zumbi as a king, not yet, but with Zumbi as a boy standing between two worlds, the world of the plantation and the world of rebellion. And in part 2, that boy escapes back into Palmares and begins the transformation into one of the most dangerous enemies slavery would ever face. History rarely gives us the luxury of certainty, especially when it comes to people whom empires wanted forgotten. The Portuguese left records, priests wrote reports, colonial officials documented rebellions, but the voices of the enslaved were rarely preserved. Their memories survived differently, in songs, in traditions, in stories passed from one generation to another. Somewhere within those fragments appears the young boy who would one day become Zumbi. Captured during a Portuguese raid, he was removed from Palmares before he was old enough to understand what had happened. One day, he belonged to a free community hidden among the mountains. The next, he belonged to the very civilization trying to destroy it. For a child, this was more than captivity. It was the beginning of a battle over identity itself. According to later accounts, the boy was delivered into the care of a Catholic priest. His new life could not have been more different. Instead of jungle paths, stone floors. Instead of war drums, church bells. Instead of African songs, Latin prayers. The priest reportedly gave him a Christian education. He learned Portuguese, he listened to scripture, he observed the customs of the Portuguese world. Some historians even believe he learned to read and write. If true, this would become one of the greatest advantages of his future leadership, because knowledge is a weapon, and sometimes understanding your enemy is more valuable than defeating him. Most children adapt to the world around them, but Zumbi lived inside two worlds simultaneously. He learned the Portuguese language, he understood their religion, he watched how colonial authority functioned, how officers issued commands, how priests influenced society, how plantation owners viewed enslaved Africans. Every conversation, every lesson, every prayer gave him another piece of knowledge. The Portuguese believed they were civilizing him. They believed they were reshaping his identity. But history has shown countless times education can transform people in unexpected ways. Perhaps they were unknowingly educating the very man who would one day organize resistance against them. Imagine being that child. You remember fragments of another life, faces, songs, voices carried by the wind. But every day, you are told those memories belong to a world that must disappear. This is where psychology becomes history. Children forced to abandon their identity often face impossible choices. Some surrender, some forget. Some survive by becoming someone new. And some carry two identities inside them until one finally prevails. For Zumbi, the jungle never truly disappeared from his memory. Freedom remained alive, even when surrounded by walls. Then, at around the age of 15, everything changed. Zumbi escaped, whether he planned it for months or seized a single unexpected opportunity. We do not know. But one thing is certain, he chose uncertainty over captivity. He chose danger over comfort. He chose freedom, even if freedom meant returning to a life of war. Many people imagine freedom as safety. History teaches something different. Sometimes, freedom demands greater sacrifice than slavery. Zumbi understood that, and still he ran. After days, perhaps even weeks of moving through rivers, mountains, and dense forests, the young fugitive finally reached the place he had never truly forgotten: Palmares. To the Portuguese, it was a nest of rebels. To plantation owners, it was a disease spreading across the colony. But to Zumbi, it was home. The people who welcomed him did not simply see a lost child returning. They saw someone who had crossed into the enemy's world and survived. He had heard their language. He had studied their customs. He had seen how their officers thought. Without realizing it, the Portuguese had returned something far more dangerous than the child they had captured. They had returned a future commander. Freedom inside Palmares was never free. Every man, every woman, every teenager understood one brutal truth. The Portuguese would return again and again and again, because Palmares represented everything the colonial world feared. Young Zumbi entered a society where survival depended upon discipline. He learned to fight with spears, with bows, with captured muskets. He learned how to disappear into the forest, how to read animal tracks, how to move silently beneath the jungle canopy, how to attack and vanish before the enemy understood what had happened. The jungle itself became a weapon. European armies trusted roads, maps, formations, supply lines. Palmares trusted something entirely different: memory. Every river had a story. Every mountain had a hidden path. Every tree could become cover. Children learned the landscape almost as soon as they learned to walk. The Portuguese entered the forest believing they were hunting fugitives. In reality, they had entered someone else's kingdom. For Zumbi, the jungle was no longer wilderness. It was strategy. Every step became part of an invisible battlefield. No one remembers the exact details of Zumbi's first battle. History often records famous victories. It rarely records the first moment a young fighter realizes war has become his life. Perhaps it was a surprise ambush. Perhaps it was a plantation raid. Perhaps it was a desperate defense against another Portuguese expedition. But somewhere, the boy disappeared. The warrior emerged. Fear never truly vanishes. The greatest fighters simply learn to keep moving despite it. That lesson would stay with Zumbi for the rest of his life. Leadership is rarely inherited. More often, it is observed. Older warriors noticed something unusual about Zumbi. He listened more than he spoke. He studied before acting. He remembered details others ignored. He combined the discipline he had witnessed among the Portuguese with the instincts of Palmares. That combination made him dangerous. He understood both worlds. He could predict how colonial officers might react. He knew their strengths. But more importantly, he knew their weaknesses. Long before becoming king, Zumbi had already begun thinking like one. By the time Zumbi reached adulthood, Palmares was no longer a hidden refuge. It had become a nation in everything but name. Its population had grown into thousands. Families farmed the fertile valleys. Blacksmiths forged tools and weapons. Scouts patrolled the mountains day and night. Children grew up knowing freedom, but they also grew up knowing war. Every few months, another Portuguese expedition entered the forests. Some came with muskets. Others brought indigenous trackers familiar with the terrain. Others carried promises of rewards for anyone willing to betray Palmares. The Portuguese had learned a painful lesson. Destroying Palmares would not be easy, so they began searching for another weapon: division. Because history has always shown, what armies cannot conquer, politics sometimes can. For decades, Ganga Zumba had carried the burden of leadership. He had seen villages burned, friends killed, children orphaned. Victory always came at a terrible cost. And then, the Portuguese offered something unexpected: peace. Not true peace, but an agreement. If Palmares accepted Portuguese authority, some of its people would receive legal freedom. The attacks would stop. The bloodshed could finally end. To exhausted families, the proposal sounded tempting. After years of war, many simply wanted their children to live. For Ganga Zumba, this was not cowardice. It was an impossible decision. Most leaders measure peace by silence. Zumbi measured peace by freedom. When he learned of the agreement, he opposed it immediately. His reasoning was brutally simple. How could Palmares celebrate freedom while millions of Africans remained enslaved across Brazil? How could a kingdom built by fugitives accept a peace that abandoned those still trapped on plantations? To Zumbi, this was not peace. It was surrender disguised as diplomacy. Freedom that depends on permission is not freedom. It is another kind of prison. For the first time, Palmares was divided, not by Portuguese weapons, but by two completely different visions of the future. History often reduces conflicts into heroes and villains. Reality is rarely that simple. Ganga Zumba wanted survival. Zumbi wanted absolute freedom. Neither man lacked courage. Neither man lacked love for his people. They simply answered different questions. Ganga Zumba asked, "How do we save those who are alive today?" Zumbi asked, "What kind of future are we leaving for tomorrow?" Both questions mattered. Both carried enormous consequences, and history would force Palmares to choose. Something changed inside Zumbi. Until now, he had fought as a soldier. Now he began thinking like a revolutionary. He no longer believed Palmares existed only to survive. He believed it existed to inspire. Every escaped slave who reached its mountains proved the Portuguese system could be defeated. Every successful defense proved Africans could govern themselves. Every child born free became living evidence that slavery was not inevitable. That idea frightened the Portuguese more than any spear. Because ideas cannot be executed, ideas cannot be chained, and once an idea begins spreading, no empire can completely stop it. Peace is often celebrated as the highest achievement of civilization, but history teaches a harsher lesson. Not every peace is built on justice. Some treaties simply delay the next war. The agreement accepted by Ganga Zumba was supposed to bring stability. Instead, it exposed a painful truth. The Portuguese had never intended to recognize Palmares as an equal nation. They wanted obedience, not coexistence, freedom, but only under colonial authority. And for many within Palmares, the illusion quickly shattered. Raids continued, slave hunters continued, plantations continued swallowing thousands of Africans every single year. The system that had created Palmares remained untouched. For Zumbi, this confirmed everything he had feared. A kingdom founded by fugitives could never trust the very empire that hunted fugitives. To him, peace without dignity was only another form of captivity. History would soon prove how right or how dangerous that belief would become. Leadership is never tested during victory. It is tested when followers begin asking impossible questions. Did Ganga Zumba betray Palmares? Modern historians remain cautious. Some believe he genuinely wanted to save lives. Others believe the Portuguese manipulated him. What is certain is that his authority began to weaken. Many younger warriors viewed compromise as surrender. Older veterans worried that accepting Portuguese terms would encourage even greater interference. Every council meeting became more divided. Every military decision became more controversial. The kingdom that had survived decades of invasion now faced its greatest enemy: internal disagreement. Empires have always understood one simple principle: if you cannot destroy your enemy from outside, make him question himself from within. And Palmares was beginning to fracture. Zumbi never announced that he wanted power. That is precisely why people began following him. He was not famous because of speeches. He became respected because he was always where danger was greatest. When scouts disappeared, he volunteered. When Portuguese patrols entered the mountains, he was among the first to respond. When food convoys needed protection, he marched beside ordinary fighters. Leadership born through shared hardship is often stronger than leadership inherited through title. The people noticed, the warriors noticed, even the Portuguese noticed. Reports arriving in colonial headquarters began mentioning a new name. Not Ganga Zumba, Zumbi, again and again and again. The Portuguese possessed cannons, professional soldiers, European weapons, international trade, colonial wealth. Zumbi possessed none of those things. His greatest resource was people who refused to surrender. Palmares could not fight like European armies. It could not afford long sieges. It could not replace heavy losses. Every fighter mattered. Every weapon mattered. Every bag of grain mattered. Instead of copying European warfare, Zumbi transformed weakness into strategy. Small units, fast movement, surprise attacks, invisible retreats, knowledge of rivers, knowledge of mountains, knowledge of fear. Long before military academies would study irregular warfare, Palmares had already mastered many of its principles. Most generals dream of decisive battles. Zumbi avoided them. He understood something timeless. The Portuguese measured victory by territory. He measured victory by survival. If an enemy army entered the forest, let the forest exhaust them. If they marched deeper, let hunger weaken them. If they split into smaller groups, strike quickly, disappear, return, repeat. The goal was never glorious victory. The goal was to make occupation impossible, to convince every Portuguese commander that entering Palmares would cost more than leaving it alone. This was not cowardice, it was mathematics. War reduced to its purest equation. Preserve your strength, destroy your enemy's confidence, win tomorrow instead of dying today. Across colonial Brazil, the plantations never truly slept. Sugar had become one of Europe's greatest addictions. Every sunrise demanded more labor. Every harvest demanded more suffering. Plantation owners believed they controlled everything. The fields, the guards, the roads, the rivers, even the lives of those they had enslaved. But somewhere beyond the cane fields, another force was growing. At first, the attacks were small. A missing shipment, a stolen horse, a warehouse mysteriously emptied before dawn. Then entire plantations began waking to something unimaginable. The enslaved had vanished, not dozens, sometimes hundreds over time. No bodies, no clues, only broken chains and footprints leading into the forest. Soon a rumor spread from plantation to plantation, one name, Zumbi. To the enslaved, it sounded like hope. To the Portuguese, it sounded like a nightmare. Military victories are powerful. Psychological victories are even stronger. Every successful escape created two completely different emotions. For the people still trapped inside the plantations, it proved freedom was possible. Hope spread faster than any messenger. Stories passed quietly between workers. Some whispered around cooking fires. Others traveled hidden inside songs. A cousin had escaped. A brother had reached Palmares. A child had survived the journey. Every story weakened fear, and every weakened fear made the next escape more likely. Meanwhile, the plantation owners faced the opposite emotion. Paranoia. Who would escape next? Who was secretly helping Palmares? Which guard could still be trusted? Zumbi understood something extraordinary. The greatest battlefield was the human mind. Palmares did not survive by hiding. It survived by growing. Every family that escaped brought something valuable. A farmer knew the land. A hunter knew the forest. A blacksmith knew metal. A carpenter built stronger defenses. Some newcomers had military experience from African kingdoms. Others understood Portuguese patrol routes. Children became the next generation of free citizens. Elders preserved traditions that slavery had tried to erase. Palmares became more than a refuge. It became a living civilization, a place where survival slowly transformed into identity. The Portuguese had hoped slavery would erase entire cultures, as those cultures were rebuilding themselves, one escape at a time. Success brought a dangerous consequence. The stronger Palmares became, the more determined the Portuguese grew. Colonial governors demanded larger military expeditions. Professional soldiers arrived, mercenaries were hired, bounty hunters entered the forests, maps were redrawn, supply routes expanded, rewards were offered for information. Some indigenous trackers were recruited because they knew parts of the jungle better than European officers. The Portuguese realized they were no longer hunting scattered fugitives. They were preparing for war against an organized society, and wars change everyone involved. Legends are not created in a single battle. They grow through repetition. Every failed Portuguese expedition added another story. Every escaped family carried another memory. Every defeated patrol strengthened another rumor. Soon, people began speaking about Zumbi, almost as if he could not be captured. Some believed he knew every path through the jungle. Others claimed he appeared and disappeared like a spirit. Fear exaggerates. Hope exaggerates. That is how legends are born. The Portuguese no longer fought only Palmares. They fought an idea wearing the face of one man. And once a leader becomes an idea, defeating him becomes far more difficult. For nearly a century, Palmares had survived. Governors changed, generals came and went, expeditions marched into the mountains, only to disappear into the jungle. Each failure carried a heavy price: money, weapons, reputation. The Portuguese Empire had conquered cities, crossed oceans, and built colonies across continents. Yet one hidden kingdom of escaped slaves continued to resist. This was no longer just a military embarrassment, it had become a political crisis. If Palmares remained free, what message would that send to hundreds of thousands still trapped on plantations? What would happen if every enslaved community believed escape was possible? The Portuguese finally reached a terrifying conclusion. Palmares could no longer be contained. It had to be destroyed. Not weakened, not negotiated with. Destroyed. If ordinary commanders could not defeat Zumbi, Portugal would send an extraordinary one. His name was Domingos Jorge Velho, a hardened bandeirante, a professional frontier fighter. Unlike many colonial officers, Velho understood irregular warfare. He had spent years hunting indigenous communities across Brazil. He knew how to survive in hostile terrain. He knew how to follow invisible trails. Most importantly, he was willing to wage total war. To him, Palmares was not a community. It was a military target, and military targets were meant to disappear. For the first time, Zumbi faced an enemy who adapted instead of repeating old mistakes. Zumbi sensed the change immediately. Scouts returned with disturbing reports: larger armies, better weapons, disciplined formations. The Portuguese were no longer testing Palmares. They were preparing to erase it. Zumbi responded the only way he knew. Every village strengthened its defenses. Food was hidden inside caves. Watchtowers remained occupied day and night. Messengers crossed the jungle without rest. No one spoke openly, but everyone understood. The greatest battle in Palmares history was approaching. For many warriors, this would not be a fight for victory. It would be a fight for memory. The heart of Palmares was Macaco. More than a village, it was the capital of an idea. The Portuguese understood that, destroy Macaco, and perhaps the entire kingdom would collapse. The assault was unlike anything Palmares had faced before. Cannons echoed through the mountains. Smoke covered the forest. Walls that had resisted for decades began to crack. Yet even then, the defenders refused to surrender. Every house became a fortress. Every pathway became an ambush. Every minute gained allowed more civilians to escape deeper into the jungle. Macaco was burning, but Palmares was still fighting. In 1694, Macaco finally fell. Buildings collapsed. The defenses were overwhelmed. The Portuguese celebrated. After generations of war, they believed they had achieved complete victory, but they misunderstood something fundamental. Kingdoms can be destroyed, ideas cannot. Many survivors escaped, others continued resisting, and Zumbi himself refused to surrender. Even without his capital, he continued fighting. Because for him, Palmares had never been just a place. It was a promise that no empire, no matter how powerful, could permanently erase the human desire to be free. The Portuguese had won the city, but the war was not yet over. When Macaco fell, many believed the story of Palmares had ended. The Portuguese celebrated across the colony. Church bells rang. Military reports declared victory. Colonial officials congratulated one another. After nearly a century, the greatest symbol of resistance had finally collapsed. But victory on paper is not always victory in reality. Because Zumbi was still alive, without a capital, without fortified walls, without the city that had once protected thousands. He became something far more dangerous. He became invisible. The jungle that had once defended Palmares now became the refuge of a single man. And history has often shown that one determined leader hiding among the people can keep an empire awake at night. The Portuguese understood one terrifying fact. As long as Zumbi lived, Palmares still lived inside the imagination of the enslaved. Every escaped slave could still believe he was somewhere in the forest. Every plantation owner could still fear another attack. Every governor risked another uprising. So the mission changed. No longer destroy Palmares. Find Zumbi, dead or alive. Rewards were announced. Scouts spread across the mountains. Former allies were questioned. Captured fighters were tortured for information. The jungle became one enormous battlefield. But hunting a man who had spent his entire life mastering that forest would prove far harder than hunting an army. Months passed, yet Zumbi remained free. This created a strange psychological effect. The Portuguese controlled the cities, but they feared the forests. They possessed cannons, yet they feared whispers. Some soldiers began believing Zumbi possessed supernatural protection. Others claimed the forest itself warned him whenever danger approached. Legends grow quickly during war, especially when fear replaces certainty. Of course, Zumbi was not a ghost. He relied on intelligence, local support, constant movement, careful planning. But to exhausted soldiers, genius often appears as magic, and every failed search strengthened the legend. Living as a fugitive changes a person. Every meal becomes uncertain. Every stranger becomes a possible informant. Every sound in the darkness demands attention. Psychologists today describe this as permanent survival mode. The body never fully rests. The mind never completely relaxes. Yet, history suggests Zumbi never considered surrender. Why? Because surrender would have meant far more than his own death. It would have told every enslaved African that resistance was ultimately hopeless. For Zumbi, remaining free was itself an act of rebellion, even if freedom lasted only one more day. History remembers many great leaders. Almost all of them share one tragic lesson. The greatest danger rarely comes from the front. It comes from someone trusted. The Portuguese eventually realized they might never defeat Zumbi in open pursuit. So they changed strategy. Instead of chasing him, they searched for someone close enough to reveal his location. Accounts differ on the exact details. Some sources speak of betrayal under pressure. Others describe torture. Others mention promises of survival. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. The Portuguese finally learned where their greatest enemy was hiding. Not through superior strength, not through superior strategy, but through information and throughout history. Information has often been the deadliest weapon of all. On the morning of November 20th, 1695, the hunt finally came to an end. For nearly 2 years after the fall of Macaco, Zumbi had remained a ghost, always moving, always fighting, always refusing to surrender. But this time, the Portuguese knew where to look. Guided by intelligence gathered from betrayal, their soldiers surrounded his hiding place before dawn. The jungle that had protected him for so many years had become a trap. Yet even then, Zumbi did not attempt to beg for mercy. He reached for his weapon, because warriors like him understand one simple truth. Freedom can be taken from the body, never from the will. No historian can reconstruct every movement of the battle, but every account agrees on one thing. Zumbi fought until the very end. He had spent his entire life resisting impossible odds. This final confrontation was no different. Outnumbered, surrounded, exhausted after years of war. Still, he refused to surrender. Perhaps he already understood what awaited him if captured alive. Perhaps he knew his death had become inevitable. But some leaders choose how history will remember them. Not by surviving, but by refusing to kneel. For the Portuguese soldiers, this was the capture of a rebel. For generations that followed, it became the final stand of a symbol. The Portuguese believed victory required more than killing Zumbi. They needed to destroy the legend. His head was taken to Recife, where it was displayed publicly. Officials wanted everyone to see it. Why? Because rumors had spread that Zumbi was immortal. Some believed he possessed supernatural protection. Others claimed bullets could not kill him. The colonial government understood the power of belief. By displaying his remains, they hoped to send a message. Look, he was only a man. But history has a strange sense of irony. Sometimes, the harder an empire tries to erase a symbol, the stronger that symbol becomes. Empires often confuse killing a person with killing an idea. They are rarely the same. Palmares eventually disappeared. Its villages vanished beneath time. Its wooden walls returned to the earth. But the question Zumbi asked never disappeared. Can human beings truly own other human beings? Centuries later, that question would help inspire abolitionists, civil rights movements, and generations searching for justice. Every society creates heroes. The greatest heroes are remembered not because they were perfect, but because they refused to accept what everyone else believed was inevitable. Zumbi became one of them, not because he won every battle, but because he never accepted slavery as normal. History remembers kings. History remembers conquerors. History remembers emperors. But every so often, history remembers someone who stood against all of them. Zumbi owned no empire. He commanded no vast navy. He left behind no magnificent palace. What he left behind was something far more difficult to destroy: hope. Today, every November 20th, Brazil observes Black Consciousness Day, a date chosen to honor the legacy of Zumbi and the long struggle against slavery and racism. His name is taught in schools. His story is studied by historians. His courage continues to inspire millions. Perhaps that is history's greatest lesson. Power built on fear eventually fades, but courage echoes across centuries. So the next time you hear the word Zumbi, don't think of monsters from fiction. Remember the man who refused to let an empire define what freedom meant. Because legends are not born when they live, they are born when the world realizes they can never truly be forgotten. Some heroes conquer kingdoms, others defend them, but only a few become symbols that outlive every empire that tried to erase them. Zumbi dos Palmares was one of those few.